cathedral is. So it's famous for its Renaissance architecture and its food, but also briefly for hosting the biggest collection of interaction designers in Europe. So the main conference itself, we had 3 days and 65 talks. And that doesn't even include the day before workshops, which there was 18 workshops, and there was also an education summit running as well at the same time. So I can't talk about all of those things in the little short time I have, even though I speak very quickly. So I'm going to speak about the 3 key themes that really resonated with me. One of which was designing for good. Another one was adding systems thinking to our toolkit. And the last one is applying some of the ways that we design and research for our customers to how we can work better together as teams. So the role of design, in a talk by Khoi Vinh, he mentioned, is shifting from, in the past, we were the people that made things pretty. Where we're at now is that we're the people that make things work. But where we actually need to be is that we think about we make it good. And it's easy for us to ask at the moment questions like, does it work? It's something we can measure and track with metrics, and it's something we can prove we value to the business. But the question about is it good, it's a trickier one for us to deal with. We need to think about things. Are the things we're making good for our customers, good for the community, and good for the world? There's been a lot of backlash lately about tech, and Alan Cooper referred to this as being design's Oppenheimer moment. Back in the 1940s, Oppenheimer worked on the Manhattan Project, which was one of the biggest scientific projects of his time. But when he saw the first atomic bomb explode, he realized the horror of his creation. And if we think about things that have been happening lately, such as stuff that was designed in Facebook to sell ads and target ads, now being used by Russians to potentially subvert the democratic process. Stuff like the Microsoft chatbot that within about 2 days of being released started spouting kind of racist and misogynistic tweets. Stuff even like autocorrect in iOS, doing things like correcting pharmaceutical drug names to other pharmaceutical drug names. And it's very easy for stuff we do to inadvertently cause harm through the way that people use it in ways that are unexpected. So what can we do? The first thing to realize is that these problems that we see are systems problems. And the technology tools we work with are complex systems, and the networked aspect of them adds another layer on top of that. So it's not something where there's an easy single point of failure or someone to blame. And in terms of then how we approach it is that first step is to have a clear goal. Alan Cooper referred to this as have a goal of being a good ancestor. So make sure that whatever you touch, you leave things better than they were before, and think about the generations that come behind you. But having a goal is not enough. We need to move beyond that and also add some new tools to our toolkit. The first thing to remember is that systems problems require systems thinking. And what exactly is systems thinking? One of the other speakers on the closing keynote described systems thinking. It's a way of seeing the world as a series of interconnected and interdependent systems rather than lots of independent parts. And we seek out a deeper understanding of how the world works so that we can design parts of the world better within it. And taking that down to a level of actual techniques we can apply in practice, something Alan Cooper refers to as working backwards. It's kind of similar to the 5 whys that you may have heard of from Agile. It's that we need to understand the problem and understand the elements in the system. So we need to understand the problem by looking at the context in which it operates and the environment in which it sits. This is where you spot the typo on your presentation. This should be considerations. So again, in examining the problems, it's a new word, TM. So we need to become lovers of problems, fall in love with the problem, and spend a lot of time understanding it before we dive into solution mode. That's something it's probably not news to most people here, but what might be is the types of questions we need to ask when we're going through this examination. One of the first of these is our assumptions. We need to be really clear about what assumptions are inherent within our product. For example, we can't assume that our staff are representative of our user base. A classic example of this would be the soap dispenser that only recognized Caucasian skin, because it had only ever been tested on the typical Silicon Valley tech bro type of workforce. Another thing to consider is externalities. when I say externalities, it's basically whenever you go, that's not my problem, that's someone else's problem, you're creating an externality. An example of this would be, say, a ride-sharing company. It creates a great experience for the riders that use it, but on the staff side, it doesn't look after them in terms of their welfare or their payment. We also have what can be sometimes the black box of AI and machine learning. And if we abdicate decision-making to those systems without having mechanisms for proper oversight, we can lead to creating significant externalities. An example of this would be a hiring algorithm based on who you've successfully hired in the past. What that does is it perpetuates any existing biases in the system, but that's not apparent or obvious to anyone. Another key thing is to think about the time scale. Basically, a lot of today's problems come from yesterday's solutions. An example of that would be Alan himself when he decided to just save a bit of space and go with the 2 digits for the year rather than 4, which kind of was part of the Y2K bug. We also have things such as the origin of the Nespresso pods. He had observed people at work with those little glass pots of coffee and throwing away a lot of coffee every single day. And he was going, that's a lot of waste. I know what I'll do. I'll make these little single-use capsules. But then we end up with a massive problem of all of those going into landfill. The other thing to consider is the external force that act on the system. What are they and what impact might they have? And when you're considering impact, consider who your product impacts. And also what type of consent is involved, who needs to give consent, what happens to those who disagree, who benefits from the system and who loses out. And also kind of put your kind of Dr. Evil hat on and think, how could someone misuse this system? And to think about these things up front. So it's very easy to get overwhelmed and think, I'm just a designer, I'm just a cog in a massive machine. So a Buckminster Fuller quote is to call me trim trap. That's the smallest little piece of machinery within the rudder of a ship. But when the ship's captain turns the steering wheel, that little piece of machinery is what changes the entire trajectory of the ship. So some of the things we work on day to day can have big impact. And part of our role is to figure out which of those key little micro aspects of the world we deal with we can actually influence and change. And it's also important to remember that we're not CEOs, we may not have power, we may not be able to act at the macro level, but we do have agency. We can act at the micro level. And basically, as Alan said, the future is in the hands of the hands-on. The other aspect of the conference I really liked is that we started talking about how we work together in teams, because this is a big job and we need all the help we can get. And also, if we think about techniques we apply to understand our users, could we apply some of those techniques to designing our workplace and the experience for our teams? So one of the talks from Zimbabwe that moved to London, he did a talk about kind of the cultural baggage you can bring to teams and how we can figure out ways to create high-performing multicultural teams. One of his big influences is Hugh Masekela, who passed away recently, but who was the father of jazz in South Africa. He, for a period, went over to the US, which was then the home of jazz, trying to hang out with Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, and all of those guys, and trying to copy them. But he received a piece of advice from Miles, which was, how is it possible you've come all the way across the ocean here to New York, which is full of thousands of jazz cats, and you want to become just like one of us? Don't you recognize that where you come from and who you are, that's what makes you unique, and that you need to use that and turn it into something that can teach us something new and bring something new into the world? That's kind of the polite version. What he actually said was this. So then, taking all of that and trying to understand your own cultural differences and what it can bring to the team and how we can find ways to work together well, he thought back to his own experience. His first job out of Zimbabwe was in London, and he was a UX designer out on the client site, and the project wasn't going well. But he was quite afraid to tell the more senior people it wasn't going well, so he let it all build up until it was too late, and he ended up getting fired from his job. So he was like, first step in understanding how we all work together is understand my own stuff. So what he did was he looked at different ways of understanding cultural backgrounds. So he looked at the work of Hofstede first, but found a lot of it was too abstract for day-to-day workplaces. So then he found the work of Ehrenmeyer and the culture models, which is you can map your culture along each of these axes. Like, say, for example, persuading, principles first versus applications first. If you're a principles first country, you explain the theory and the methodology of how you did your study. Then you will give what you learned, and then you'll give your recommendations. Whereas if it's an applications first culture, you'll typically do executive summary, what we learned, part 2 recommendations. Then you go and explain how you got to where you were. And then, in terms of how you would use this in your day-to-day work, say for an example, if you have people on the disagreeing spectrum that range from confrontational to avoiding confrontation, acknowledging that fact and thinking of ways you could potentially workshop, how do we give feedback as a team? Also role-playing difficult conversations, so people can see that it's okay to disagree with someone. It doesn't cost you the world. Because his main point is that we need to get beyond the way we currently think of diversity and think about it in terms of diversity of thought. And it's more than just different shades of brown or gender. It's you need to pay attention to what the world needs from our industry, and we also need to pay attention to what our colleagues need from us. So what he recommends doing is, inspired by Hugh, just understand all of these different vectors that people can differ along, and just put it with your own, where you come from, and it's going to be great. And the team at IxDA have done a marvellous job, so all the talks are actually available already on their Vimeo channel. And if you want to have a truly on experience, I recommend a glass of Côte d'Iron, some charcuterie and cheese. Cool, thank you.